the colleagues and students have been actually actively being members of the opposition and being effectively in prison, and unfortunately these kind of students are also very much affected by the current events. But anyway, I go to my presentation. Sorry. So the paper or the article, in the end, this is a kind of a short version of it, what I'm trying to do, and any feedback on the thoughts, what I have here, very welcome. More critical, the better. So I will explore registration of religious communities from the perspective of international human rights law requirements, whatever they are, of state neutrality and impartiality regarding religions or beliefs. And I will also probe into the benefits related to registration, including, for example, access to education or providing education even. And my focus, as I said, is going to be on Russia and on selected USSR, former USSR countries, probably pick from the current CIS countries, Commonwealth of Independent States, and pick from the European countries, not the Central Asian countries. That are also simultaneously, but now, of course, there is a bit of a question, especially regarding Russia, which are simultaneously part of the ECtHR, the European Convention of Human Rights, and UN Human Rights Treaty. But well, Russia is still part of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, for sure, for a moment at least. Registration of religious communities in these countries is tied to problematic assumptions of what is needed for security. And I define it in a broad way, also encompassing not only physical security, but also moral security. It can be argued that registration is seen as a tool to control and provide security. This approach is not necessarily in compliance with the understanding of neutrality and impartiality in international law. One also cannot overlook the role and influence of Russia itself via various regional frameworks, for example, CIS, Eurasian Economic Union, common or collective security treaty organization, and etc., and also through the cooperation in the region. This may have also contributed to some similarities in the way these countries' laws deal with extremist activities, minority religions and their registration, but also with the requirements of the state neutrality and impartiality. From international law perspective, one can witness perhaps also regionalization or fragmentation of international human rights law generally and freedom of religion or belief specifically. Russian attempt to influence states in the region through application of its very controversial concept of Russian world plays a role as well. Under the Russian world, Ruski Mir, Putin's government promotes what's an idea that Russia is not a mere nation state, but the civilization state that has an important role to play in world's history. Included within this civilizational framework are ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in former Soviet republics that extend beyond Russia's own national borders. It also encompasses the idea of Russia being the last bastion of traditional values and conservatism, which translates in itself, you can imagine, also into the educational environment in certain circumstances. The use of this concept, of course, has wide implications, not just in the CIS countries. It affects also states that have, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, have chosen a more democratic path, I would say, and either are already part of EU and NATO, like Baltic states, or are attempting or seeking to join these organizations. Well, again, I have to say that I started to write this position paper before the armed conflict broke out. And in the light of that, I had new thoughts. For a note, it could be noted here that Ukraine, for example, was also part of the founding members of the CIS. However, it never signed and ratified the founding treaty. Nevertheless, it has participated in CIS in various forms through its treaties on and off basis, I would say, depending on the political leadership in power. And the relationship, of course, went cold after the Maidan 2014 annexation of Crimea and war in separatist regions. Georgia, also one of the founding members, withdrew officially in 2008 after the armed conflict between Russia and Georgia. So there are Belarus and Moldova and some Central European states still involved in that. Armenia and Azerbaijan as well. Some argue that that what we are witnessing now is a completely new situation. Depending on the course of the war, this situation may also have serious consequences on minorities in occupied territories, a scenario that is already well known and documented in Crimea and in separatist regions since 2014, but it may also have consequences to freedom of religion or belief and neutrality in Western-minded democratic countries. The latter is not a new situation. Securitization of certain religions has happened already before. Let's think of Islam, but also, for example, Russian Orthodox Church in early 90s after the collapse of the USSR, when it was seen as a fifth column in some states that regained independence. For example, in Estonia, the registration process of the Orthodox Church in Moscow Patriarchate was a lengthy process and ended up in a bitter legal and canonical conflict between that church and Estonian Orthodox Church in Constantinople Patriarchate. And the conflict or the debate was over property and legal continuity. And state also had a role in this conflict. Similar conflicts can be observed in many other ex-communist countries with big Orthodox communities like Romania, Bulgaria, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine. Both the registration and related property conflict were eventually solved in Estonia, and it needs to be mentioned that these past conflicts do not seem to have had detrimental effect on religious life of Orthodox believers today. The concerns then of security and quite serious concerns as they pertain to the state's territorial integrity did not amount to the setting additional restrictions on the freedom of religion or belief. However, now it remains to be seen what the new situation will bring domestically in individual states, but also how the possible emerging issues will be assessed in the light of international human rights law. One may also wonder if the way international monitoring bodies, such as the European Court of Human Rights or Human Rights Committee that supervises civil and political rights governance, and even European Court of Justice, how they will look at the state neutrality from freedom of religion or belief in the future, whether that, how they look at it, will change. Just to note that Patriarch Kirill, who is the head of the Moscow Patriarchate, has not condemned the war. He keeps talking about Russian world and common history that is supposed to bring peace. However, the Russian Orthodox Church itself is not united on the matter, and there are voices of dissent in that church as well. So it will be very interesting how these factual circumstances are going to play out at the international level. As to, and I will, as I do have only 2 minutes left, I think I will skip some things what I would like wanted to say. Perhaps I could only mention that we can argue that at an international level, or when we look at the European Court of Human Rights practice and through the lens of also whatever the state neutrality means, then in the cases of registration, we can argue that there are certain standards in place, and the margin of appreciation definitely in these cases has been very, narrow, especially when we look at the cases which have been coming from the Eastern Europe. Perhaps, I mean, originally the reason was that newly joining the European Convention of Human Rights, that was felt that there was a need to teach these countries to, and for a good reason, to certain standards. So that maybe in international sort of framework terms, there is not that much debate what exactly the registration should look like. There should be some sort of form of legal recognition allowed to communities. However, you know, states have had a different approach to these things, especially in Eastern Europe. Certain requirements what are in place for registration, for getting these benefits which are involved with the registration, have had different approaches. But I stop here. You got my main gist of my argument, and a bigger paper will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Merilin. Well, we can join you in solidarity vis-à-vis our colleagues and friends in Ukraine, colleagues at the National Academy of Sciences, Education Sciences in Kiev. We have constantly contact with them on a daily basis. I just had a message from one of my colleagues at the Academy, but also our friends and colleagues in Russia, because they are in shock. I contacted several of my colleagues at the National Research University, High School of Economics in Moscow. There will be a brain drain, and some of my students passed a fortnight in jail indeed. So, but again, should not be the reason to block or to drop our links with Russians who still believe in fundamental rights and in European dimensions. And once I had to criticize and to analyze the Russian education law. Some of you do know that we have a long experience over there, more than 15 years. So the wide range of preventive measures, besides of course accreditation, but attestation, license, recognition. So a wide range of about 5-6 techniques on hindering education initiatives and alternatives based on denominationals. So definitely Russia would be on our agenda for the next future, and let us try to make that quite clear also for our friends and colleagues over there. Yes, can we move now quickly to the next speaker, please? We hardly do know each other until now, but that definitely will change. I hope so. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Ashley. Thanks for the great organization, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm in the unenviable position of being the last speaker of the post-lunch panel, and also given the last paper of the day. So I had to think very carefully about my strategy to capture your attention and your imagination, and I've thought of a thought experiment today. So my paper is based on a fictional scenario, which is not entirely fictional, to be honest, because the legislation I'm going to talk about is very close to a recent Greek legislation. So let's imagine we have a country in the Council of Europe which has passed a new law that compels everyone who works in public or private healthcare facilities to get vaccinated against the new, deadly, and highly transmissible disease. Let's assume that there is incontrovertible scientific evidence that the disease in question is highly transmissible and life-threatening. Now, according to this law, healthcare employees who remain unvaccinated 3 months from the enactment of the law will be immediately excluded from the workplace. They will suffer severe pay deductions, and after a while they could be permanently suspended. Now, this is really unfortunate for Maria. my fictional protagonist in this thought experiment, who is an Orthodox Christian pediatrician. Maria refuses to get vaccinated on the grounds of her religion, and as a result, she's dismissed from her job in a public hospital. She believes that this particular vaccine violates one of the most fundamental principles of her Christian faith. She believes that because our bodies belong to God, they ought to be clear of unnecessary impurities. Her belief is sincere, but doesn't agree with the official position of the synod of her church, which has actually come out in favor of vaccinations. Also, her objections, Maria's objection, is not special or unique. Many other healthcare employees have put forward conscientious objections to mandatory vaccinations, and let's assume that the available data show no statistically significant differences between religious, political, or philosophical objections. Let's say that religious beliefs are used to ground conscientious objections almost as often as political beliefs, like libertarian beliefs against state intervention in individual healthcare. In many cases, the two sets of beliefs are hard to disentangle. Now, is the scenario's mandatory vaccination scheme for healthcare staff a form of unlawful religious discrimination against Maria? That's my main question here. I'm not going to talk much about neutrality because the concept of neutrality, I think, isn't particularly helpful in this context. The more I was reading about mandatory vaccinations and religious discrimination, the more I was thinking that the answers will and perhaps should come from the values underlying the right to freedom of religion and religious anti-discrimination and the relationship of those values with public health. They do not come from neutrality, which at least in this context of public health seems to provide limited guidance and has this evanescent quality that other speakers today have pointed out. That's probably useful to observe on its own. We could extrapolate, I suppose, some ideas about the modest role of neutrality in a liberal theory of rights, but that's not what my paper aims to do today. So I'll go back to my main question. So first of all, I think that here we're talking about indirect discrimination rather than direct discrimination. The rule in question is facially neutral, there is a strange sound. Do I do this for some reason?
It's the tablet.
It's my tablet. Okay, I'll put it here. Okay. So the ruling question is facially neutral here. Doesn't target any particular beliefs. It imposes a particular disadvantage on Maria compared to others who do not share her religious convictions against the vaccine. So the rule seems to indirectly discriminate against Maria. And I say seems because we need to decide whether her refusal to get vaccinated is a protected belief. In other words, a belief within the scope of the prohibition of religious discrimination. Here, the prohibition of religious discrimination derives the standards that determine which kinds of beliefs are protected from the right to freedom of religion. So in other words, both rights protect beliefs of sufficient cogency, coherence, cohesion, and importance. Now, Maria has an important role to play here. Before the courts, she has to use specific arguments to substantiate the sincerity of her belief and draw the links between her refusal to get vaccinated and her Christian faith. As the case of Wawryka, and I'll come back to Wawryka in a bit, showed, the courts will place a lot of weight on the subjective experience of the believer at this stage, and the believer is expected to make specific arguments to convince the courts that their refusal to get vaccinated was within what the European Court of Human Rights called in a WIDA a sufficiently close and direct nexus with a protected belief. Now, it doesn't matter here that Maria's refusal to get vaccinated is not a duty mandated by her religion. That's not required for her action to be covered by the right to freedom of religion and religious anti-discrimination. Also, her belief doesn't have to be widely shared among her country's Orthodox Christian believers, even if her belief was not shared by any other Orthodox Christian in her country. Her belief and the disadvantage she suffered because of her belief could still fall within the protective scope of religious anti-discrimination. The definition of indirect religious discrimination in European human rights law talks about particular disadvantage. And what particular disadvantage requires is that the disadvantage was caused because of an act directly motivated by the claimant's religion. Particular disadvantage does not necessarily require an identifiable, even if small, actual group of people who should have been at disadvantage in order for Maria to fall within the protective scope of religious anti-discrimination. A hypothetical group would suffice. So Maria's case could, in principle, fall within the protective scope, I think, of indirect religious discrimination. Now, in that case, this is only, of course, the beginning of the argument, because in that case, the court must determine whether this indirectly discriminatory rule is justified by a legitimate aim, and if the means of achieving that aim are proportionate and necessary. Now, a few words on legitimacy and proportionality, and I'm going to draw to a significant extent on the recent case of Vavrika from the European Court of Human Rights, which was on mandatory vaccinations of children. Vavrika is a nuanced decision of the court, and I don't have the time to do it full justice here, but I'll focus on just a few points. Firstly, mandatory vaccinations pursue the legitimate aim of public health. I think that's obvious, but they pursue that aim in two distinct ways, an individual and a collective way. In the individual dimension, which is the more obvious one, the law aims to protect individuals from a life-threatening and highly transmissible disease. In the collective dimension, the law in our hypothetical example aims to reduce the risk that those who, because of medical reasons, cannot get vaccinated will catch the virus whenever they access healthcare facilities. So this second collective dimension is linked to the protection of the rights of others through social solidarity, which is a value that the European Court of Human Rights expressly mentioned in Vavrika. In my hypothetical example, the value of social solidarity is relevant to the functioning of healthcare services because they must be kept as open and as accessible as possible for everyone. And for similar reasons, the value of social solidarity was relevant in the context of Vavrika, which focused on schools. But in other contexts, like the general public space, evidently the normative power of the value of social solidarity would be weaker than that. Secondly, what Vavrika shows is that the evidence basis of laws mandating vaccinations plays a central role and will be strictly scrutinized by the European Court of Human Rights. So we need here credible evidence, not only to prove that vaccination is essential to protect the lives of individuals, but also, and that's an important point, also to show specifically why there is a need to achieve the highest possible degree of vaccine coverage in a certain context, be that primary schools in Vavrika or hospitals in my hypothetical example. Without a very strong evidence basis across both those fronts, it's unlikely that mandatory vaccinations will be appropriate and necessary. Thirdly, even if there is strong evidence showing that mandatory vaccinations are required, that doesn't mean the states are given a carte blanche. The scope of the vaccination duty must still be very carefully outlined. The vaccination duty cannot be absolute. 3 points are relevant here. Vaccines must not be forcibly administered on individuals. Secondly, those with contraindications must be exempted. Thirdly, procedural fairness must be respected. And I will set those points aside for now, but all those points proved important in Vavrika. Now, even if the scope, the evidence basis, and the procedural fairness of mandatory vaccinations are appropriate and necessary to protect public health, the scheme could still amount to a disproportionate interference with religious freedom. In other words, there could still be cases where the protection of public health might be outweighed by the values of ethical independence, toleration, and pluralism that are embedded and reflected in the protection of the right to freedom of religion or belief. Is our case such a case? Would the fact that the law in our hypothetical scenario allows no conscientious objection violate Maria's right to freedom of religion? Let me sketch a quick answer. It all depends on whether, in the specific context of this case, the legitimate aim of the law could be served only if there is no room for conscientious objections. Now, recall, Maria is a pediatrician, so she has to examine children in person. She also has to talk to their parents, their carers, or their grandparents. That people-facing part of the job is a constitutive part of the role of a pediatrician in a public hospital. So Maria cannot be moved to working from home for the foreseeable future, let's say. So in that particular case, it is likely that given the evidence on the transmissibility of the virus, etc., not accommodating her conscientious objection would not violate her right to freedom of religion. No other way of balancing between public health and religious freedom seems possible in this context. However, the outcome would be different for other staff in healthcare facilities, like those working on logistics or human resources, who might be able to work in non-people-facing roles or from home. A mandatory vaccination scheme that leaves no space whatsoever for their conscientious exemption would probably not be a proportionate interference with the right to freedom of religion or belief. Now, I have one final point. Let's assume for a moment, that's a big assumption, that my analysis is not completely wrong, and in the specific context we're discussing, Maria's complaint under freedom of religion does prove unsuccessful. Would her complaint against the law fare better if it was grounded on the prohibition of religious discrimination instead of the right to freedom of religion? Sadly, I think the news are not good for our friend Maria, because I don't think so. And I'll explain very quickly why I don't think so. In an article I published a couple of years ago in the Modern Law Review, I argued that the rights to freedom of religion and religious anti-discrimination share their main normative ground, but they're not synonymous. Their emphasis is different. Religious anti-discrimination has a horizontal emphasis on ensuring that individuals can access important opportunities like employment or education, opportunities that have little to do with the manifestation of religion or belief, without disadvantage on account of their perceived religion or belief. Because of the horizontal emphasis of religious anti-discrimination on distributive justice, which is, of course, where the emphasis of discrimination law more generally is, sometimes religious anti-discrimination can offer more protection than religious freedom. That happens primarily when the disadvantage in question occurs intersectionally, when religion interacts with gender or race or ethnic origin or all of them together. So when the suffered disadvantage is not just individual, but correlates with the socioeconomic disadvantage suffered by a particular protected group, then in those cases, religious anti-discrimination can provide more protection to individual claimants than religious freedom. In such cases, cases of group disadvantage, religious anti-discrimination aligns with racial anti-discrimination and gender anti-discrimination. For instance, it invites stricter judicial scrutiny and a much narrower margin of appreciation compared to the right to freedom of religion. However, our hypothetical scenario is not a case of intersectional religious discrimination. Maria's disadvantage is distributed relatively evenly between different belief groups, different genders and ethnicities. So religious anti-discrimination would not provide her with more protection. In cases like this hypothetical scenario, where the suffered disadvantage is predominantly individual, religious freedom and religious anti-discrimination doctrinally overlap. So the reasons for not finding a violation of the right to freedom of religion would be equivalent to the reasons that could justify indirect religious discrimination. So if Maria's right to freedom of religion were to be outweighed by public health, then by the same token, indirect religious discrimination would have been justified in this case too. So that's all I want to discuss with you at this point. Thanks for embarking with me in this thought experiment. Looking forward for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilias. Thank you so much. I guess we should stop now and start just a workshop on this case, debating this case, vaccination and all your. It's so relevant, and to some extent, it sounds familiar with the debates we had in most of our European countries. Your legal reasoning is pertinent, perhaps questionable from some perspectives, but it invites us to think on the consequences of your statements, and so that would again invite us to organize Stan another journey of expert meetings on these cases and similar cases. Thank you so much, Ilias. Yeah, well, last discussant. Thank you so much again, Effie, to do the job, because it will not be that easy, but we trust, of course, your commitments, Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I want to start off by echoing many colleagues in the room and saying this also is my first international conference since COVID, and I'm so pleased to be here. I'm so pleased that it's amongst you all in this former prison in this lovely city. I also want to echo Merilin in saying I also stepped into this role very last minute. I was to do something else at this conference, and so it's more difficult in the sense that I haven't had that much time to work in depth with the papers, and also Merilin sent hers very apologetically rather late, so even less so, but I finished reading it over lunch, so I have some comments at least. I have written them and will read mainly so that I don't stray too much. Starting with yours, Julie, I enjoyed them all, first of all, very much. Some points I'll present randomly and in no particular order, okay? Hidden in a footnote is a comment which, to my mind, is rather key to a broader discussion of state neutrality vis-a-vis religion. In footnote 3, you indicate that you only consider cases that deal directly with freedom from religion, and that there are other cases where contestation of religion's power is indirect, e.g. disputes on family, sexuality, bioethics, abortion, same-sex marriage. And you write, the restrictive position of certain governments on these matters often reflects the persisting influence of the dominant religious tradition in the country concerned. You indicate, though, that this dimension of the case law usually remains implicit. But in practice, those sorts of limitations can be so many in number and so weighty in import that it seems to me they should be included somehow in your tripartite framework of different European Court of Human Rights approaches to neutrality. You use the word understandings of neutrality. I opt for approaches because I think there may sometimes be a real chasm between judges' understandings of the court's approaches, but I'll get to that point later. Their understandings, and on the one hand, the approaches the court takes in the end. Would it be possible to include such challenges to neutrality in your framework of court approaches, those kinds that are implicit, like you say? How about neutrality is compatible with implicit accommodations of religion? It's not a particularly graceful title, but something to that effect, which allows space for attention to the phenomenon, which I suspect actually takes a lot of space in European Court of Human Rights case law, indirectly related to religion, and which certainly takes a lot of space in real-life contestations of the place of religion in the public sphere. It's not a critique of your decision to limit your approach, but an invitation to stretch just that further to include this dimension, because I think it's one where some of the greatest difficulties in achieving state neutrality are revealed. Explicit expressions of religion's power are a whole lot easier for the court to identify and to try to strike down than the implicit ones. At a first superficial glance, that's the first point. Second, at a first superficial glance, your paper much reminded me of Matthias Koenig's 2012 book chapter, which you cite also in the text. In it, Matthias also writes in terms of evolution of the case law, and he presents a three-step evolution of the court's jurisprudence on matters of religion, moving from heavy use of the margin of appreciation in the beginning in protecting majority religion to increasingly assertive secular stances, first applied to Islam and then extending even to majority Christianity. And the 2009 Laozi Chamber decision was a stellar case in support of this linear process that Matthias is presenting. And then the 2011 Grand Chamber decision comes to completely upset Matthias's neat linear approach and his framework. Here I want to pause to note that on the way here, I celebrated my daughter's 11th birthday just before this weekend. She was born on the day of the Grand Chamber decision. And it struck me to think that Laozi is actually 11 years old. I mean, it seems far more recent. Okay, that's an aside. Now, writing with a bit of hindsight in 2014 in a book chapter, you writing there about you had a bit of hindsight on the Grand Chamber Laozi decision in Amiro and others' edited volume. You indicated that the Grand Chamber decision represented a backtracking to the court's earlier stance of non-coercive neutrality, as you've said today. And building on that in a later text, you wrote in terms of a three-stage evolution too, but non-linear. Non-coercive neutrality, neutrality without preference, and then going back to non-coercive neutrality. Now, in this text, if I read it correctly, you seem to be communicating a certainty only about the first two stages of evolution, and the third point is not really communicated as an actual shift in stage, but you present two cases as kind of a special case in religious symbolism, as a backtracking mainly on 2 points in 2 cases, and with a kind of pregnant question mark, is it a special case? So you present those 2 cases of backtracking, Laozi Grand Chamber and Perovi, decided in Laozi's shadow. So I want to prod you to ask you to elaborate a bit on what you're communicating here. Do you see the reversions to a non-coercive neutrality as a third stage in an evolution? Or rather, do you see these decisions focused on religious symbolism in state schools as a special case? To your understanding, is this backtracking specific to religious symbols in state schools, or are there other cases that we shouldn't consider? Is it so focused on one theme? And further to that point, just to, in terms of symmetry, where does the exclusion of religion from the public sphere fit into the architecture of your paper, that 4th point that you present in your paper? As it's presented as an argument, not as some stage in jurisprudential evolution. It's just a separate kind of argument. And I think probably, or at least highly possibly, you're speaking to the choir here, amongst this audience at least, in terms of the argument that you're making. That absence of preference does not amount to exclusion of religion from the public space. So somehow I feel that this point or this topic is less valuable or is less necessary in argument form, and that it would be more helpful to foreground the relevant cases as part of your evolutionary overview. What do the exclusions that you describe have in common in this Dalab, Dogru, Kervanji, the Singh cases, Shaheen, and Ibrahimian? They all have Islam in common. So I wonder if you would make that more visible, what that does to your tripartite description, and also your evolutionary perspective. And that leads me to a 4th and final point. Are we interested here in this room in the reasons behind what you describe as the incomplete evolution, whereby the court progresses from an absence of coercion definition of neutrality to an absence of preference, and then sometimes at least, it strays back? Is the why question relevant to our discussions today? Personally, I'm really intrigued by the why question. And I wonder if you were to transpose onto your study another layer, looking at the court as an institution operating at a particular time in its own evolution, between law and politics, is the topic of the title of that Christofferson and Madsen edited volume that I so like, and seeing the court as a living instrument that is operating in a somewhat sensitive way in relation to Western European, especially societal reactions to a growing Muslim presence, and in relation to currents underlying the Brighton process, the Brexit, and populist nationalisms that surged around people like Viktor Orban and Matteo Salvini. Such forces may be on the wane, hopefully they're on the wane, but certain religious groups and certain states have clung to these perceived mainstreamings of their perspectives. And I think there are longer term impacts of this kind of mainstreaming. And in this added layer of analysis, I'd be interested to see you engage even further with the work of Laurie Beeman and Marian Burchard on the trend of individuals, groups, and states increasingly trying to recast religious symbols as cultural ones, or as artifacts of heritage and national identity, and thus theoretically harmless to atheist and secular sensitivities. And so from this perspective, beyond the shift within the court from Laozi 1 to Laozi 2, you would also consider what was happening outside of the court, that unprecedented mobilization around that case of states and NGOs, leading to an unprecedented, at least at that time, number of third-party interventions before the European Court of Human Rights. So again, I don't know how interested you are or the audience is in these why questions, but to my mind, the pulse of politics or of political sociology is worth considering, at least when trying to make sense of this incomplete evolution that you describe. Pause to go to Merilin's, which I said, again, the reading was a bit thinner. I only managed a quick skim of the abstract last night, so I made some comments and then read the rest today. First, you present the registration regulations as linked to security, physical and moral. Where, if anywhere, does the concept of national identity fit into your assessment? I read security in the text, but I think of how Putin and others seek to secure national identities specifically by preserving the dominant place of majority religion in each case. And bringing to the topic our current considerations in this conference, it seems that the European Court of Human Rights is increasingly dealing with not so much with registration issues, but with impacts that have to do with Russia's influence as a moral entrepreneur and in its active engagement in transnational mobilizations to support religious limitations over socio and bioethical issues like abortion, same-sex rights, etc., those topics that I was just mentioning to Julie. Here, Russia's influence goes well beyond the CIS states in what Pasquale and Aquino has described as a holy alliance between American conservative evangelicals, the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Vatican. Christina Stoichel has also written extensively on this, and I wonder if you have used her work about the broader impact of Russia, both the Russian Orthodox Church and Kremlin in this case. And I know your focus is on registration, but I see all of this as part of a larger story seeking to preserve Russian national identity and the place of orthodoxy therein. And so I wonder if it's worth looking at that work. Just very briefly on the point of registration, you note somewhere, it needs to be noted that there are religious communities that do not want to obtain legal personality. We have many such cases in the Greek case. We had finally a new law on registration of religious groups introduced in 2014, 17 years later after a conviction in the Church of Canea case at the European Court of Human Rights. So it's a very slow process of reacting to that. But there are many religious groups that don't want to register formally because of the constrictions that it entails, and they feel like that it would entail too much government control over their activities. So yeah, just that case. And last but not least, Ilias, a paper which I also really enjoyed reading, and you know, it's very engaging and of course very timely. I have personally come across a few of your hypothetical Marias in the Greek context. My reading of this paper exposes me as a non-lawyer, and while I can follow the technicalities of the analysis, where you walk us through the personality tests and legitimate aims and procedural fairness, I admit that I don't have a full grasp of the logic regarding the order in which all of the above is correctly applied to a case, like hypothetical Maria's case, so that we arrive at the proper conclusion. I certainly accept your conclusion, and I think most in this room would, but yeah, so I'm saying, as a non-lawyer, I think I'll stick safely within the realm of my own field, political sociology, and think in terms of the grassroots level impacts of the European Court of Human Rights case law. So in this paper, you're contending with an acute concern of large swathes of populations across the globe, people even less able than I am to follow the procedural fairness and proportionality technicalities, but people eager to know whether their claims to a right to exemption from vaccine mandates are legally justifiable. And in research I've conducted on grassroots level awareness of European Court of Human Rights case law, you mentioned earlier today that you're familiar with that, my research team and I found strikingly low levels of popular awareness of jurisprudence of the court, even in cases which speak directly to intense concerns that they have. Comparatively, even though I know that we shouldn't compare apples and oranges, the general population in the US actively seeks, looks to the US Supreme Court for answers to some of their pressing concerns. They're very curious, what is the US Supreme Court going to say? And it struck me in reading your text that we need a user-friendly version of this text, not addressed to scholars, which communicates the logic whereby the religious exemption claim would not be supported at the European Court of Human Rights. And here it's clear that it's not just European Court of Human Rights awareness that's lacking amongst general populations, but also a lack of responsibilities awareness, the responsibilities that come along with rights for citizens. Again, comparing apples and oranges, and without having conducted research on this topic, my sense is that also in the US, there are relatively low levels of responsibilities awareness, and that the concept of social solidarity to which you refer in your paper would also perhaps be lost on an American public. My biased feeling is that maybe the European Court of Human Rights might have an easier time selling the idea of social solidarity to its publics as a reason why religion-based exemption claims might be rejected by the court. But it seems that the European Court of Human Rights doesn't really try selling anything to its publics, and I find that really problematic. There's an incredible disconnect between its legal power and its potential social power. And a second point, and I'll have to beg your forgiveness for my ignorance here, you make this point in your paper that if Maria's religious objection were accommodated, then the door would be open for the accommodation of non-religious conscientious objections to mandatory vaccinations, such as those of the highly politicized libertarians like her hypothetical, the hypothetical cardiac surgeon at the same hospital. So also a familiar story in the Greek context. And you note that an accommodation, would necessarily open the doors to the claims of such people. And assuming that's the case, I want to ask, are you suggesting that the court limits a right that it might have offered Maria otherwise, were it not for the many Novaks in the world? And if so, do you think that that takes us back to the socio-political concerns I was talking about earlier in relation to Julie's paper? Also, I wonder, would your hypothetical surgeon, like Maria, equally potentially benefit from, and is there, I don't know if there's an equivalent of like forum shopping for ECtHR article shopping, would he potentially benefit from raising his claim under Article 14 instead of making a discrimination claim? And finally, and connecting your paper to Julie's, do religious exemptions violate state neutrality? And if so, in which of Julie's senses? It seems not to fit neatly into the neutrality as absence of coercion approach, nor in the absence of preference approach, nor exclusion from the public sphere. So I wonder if we could somehow think in those terms and kind of fit it in. Thank you.
Thank you, Effie. Wonderful. You're opening many doors. So a quick short room for questions from the audience. Yes, medical, please. Merilin. Yeah. Try this mic.
Okay, thank you very much. I have two questions from the online audience. The first is for Professor Trispiotis, which is, could you elaborate on what specific criteria you think determine whether consensus objection is possible? And the second is for Professor Ringelheim, which is, when you look at the case law of the European Court of Human Rights and try to understand the principle of neutrality, do you make a distinction between the doctrine where constitutional courts are cited and where the European Court itself independently formulates the content of the neutrality principle, and why? Thank you.
So I didn't understand the question.
Okay, I'm gonna read it out loud again. Just so when you look at the case law of the European Court of Human Rights and try to understand the principle of neutrality, do you make a distinction between the doctrine where constitutional courts are cited and where the European Court itself independently formulates the content of the neutrality principle, and why?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No.
Thank you. I have a few small, very technical things for Ilias. So I think that the argument flies, but I think you have to add one element in your argument, and that is that the disease that you're discussing, you can be protected against the disease through herd immunity. So in the case of measles, herd immunity works, and then being vaccinated, vaccinating helps you, but COVID, it turns out it didn't work. So you have to bring that in. And another more practical thing, and that is that in the Netherlands, it turned out that healthcare workers are the best protected workers against COVID because they had this very good protection clothing. So you could say if that argument would work in your case as well, a mandatory vaccination would be disproportionate because she could be protected and others could be protected through these protective clothing. So you have to find a way to work that out because that it would be disproportionate if clothing would do the trick.
Thank you, Roland. Yes, please, Stan. Yeah.
Thank you, Jan. I have many questions for all of you, but I will limit myself to one question to Julie because I was very convinced by your three typologies and how the court has evolved from one to the other and then potentially taking a step back, or however you want to put it, in Lautsi and then Perovi. Bringing in the freedom from religion cases, I'm no longer as convinced, ironically. And let me say why. I wonder to what extent the court has really evolved towards this absence of preference conception. I'm convinced when you cite Folgero. I'm less convinced when you cite the official oaths cases, because in those cases, the court uses language of people being forced to swear, being required to swear, having a right not to be obliged, which all indicate a sort of reliance on the fact that they were being coerced into doing something that went against their beliefs. So I'm not really sure how, you know, that fits into the coercion conception of neutrality versus the absence of preference. And perhaps maybe the borders are not as clear cut, or perhaps Lautsi and Perovi are not so much the outlier cases as we initially, and I as well thought. It's a thought that occurred to me while reading your paper.
Mm-hmm. Yes, to one question, Prof. Evans, no. We've got a lot to think about. Yes, indeed. Yeah, of course. No other interventions from audience. Okay, Julie, your turn.
Okay, does it work?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for all these very stimulating questions. So I'll start with Stein. I don't agree with you, I think, because the official oath cases are, okay, the first cases I mentioned, so it's Buscarini. Here, there is, it's true, you can say, so it concerned a deputy in San Marino who had to take their oath on the gospel, and they didn't have the choice, they had to. So here I agree with you, it's an issue of compulsion. But the subsequent cases involve a possibility of exemption. So it's cases that are that you can compare with religious teaching cases, because the problem was, these are Greek cases, and they concern the official oaths that lawyers and then witnesses had to take, and the default oath was on the gospel, but there was a possibility of exemption. But in order to benefit from this exemption, there were certain conditions. So what the court, so it's not mere compulsion, because there is a possibility to not to take the religious oath, but the way things are arranged clearly show a preference for the religious oath, because that's what is proposed. And if you want something else, you have to justify it. And so the court says several things, but it does also criticize the fact that the state assumes that people will normally take the oath, the religious oath. And it also criticizes the fact that you have to justify and to disclose your religious conviction if you want to escape from this. So I think if it was the court or the commission from the 1980s looking at this, it could have said there is no problem. People are not forced to take the religious oath, so there is no conflict with freedom of religion. Now the online question. So do I make a distinction when the court refer to constitutional court's argument? I didn't make a special, I mean, in fact, there are only, I suppose this person is referring to cases dealing with the prohibition of religious symbols, where, because otherwise in the cases I've mentioned, I don't think this really interferes. So I look at what the European Court of Human Rights says about neutrality. And there might be cases in which it endorses what the Constitutional Court said, but in this case, I consider that it becomes the position of the European Court of Human Rights. I hope I understood the question correctly. So, and now Effie's comments, so these were very rich comments. I think, Effie, you made very good points and very good suggestion of how I could elaborate and expand this paper, but then I think it will become a book. So my first answer is that I decided to focus on this issue of freedom from religion claims. And this is why and also the paper had to be small, and I had to be able to present it in 15 minutes. So this is why I didn't elaborate on all these cases regarding the wearing of religious symbols, because this is a different topic than a freedom from religion claim. But at the same time, I wanted to make this case about the different conception of neutrality. So I thought it was important to, because often in comments about LOTSI, some people do equate the two, what I call neutrality as absence of preference and neutrality as exclusion from religion. So you had, I mean, a number of commentators who said, well, if the court would have would have considered that displaying crucifix in school, no, sorry, I'm confused now. Well, some people do equate the idea that displaying crucifix in public school is contrary to neutrality, means that you consider neutrality as exclusion of religion from the public sphere. And I think that these ideas are different. So that was the point I was trying to make, but then I understand your reaction that then it's I didn't present all the case law that is behind this conception. Now, regarding your comment about the fact that I don't comment on the sociological, political factors that explain these changes in the court's views, yes, all these factors are important, and I'm of course aware of them, but my paper is about trying to understand how the court conceives neutrality, so it's more a conceptual paper. Is it, and how does it justify its position? So of course there is all this socio-political background which can explain, but you know, my angle is different. I want to take seriously what the court says, and even if the court is influenced by all sorts of factors, at the end of the day, when it takes a judgment, it has to justify its finding. And I want to analyze this justification and see whether it makes sense, whether it's convincing, and what kind of conception there is behind it. So that's my objective in this paper. That's why I didn't go into all this socio-political background, but maybe I could, in fact, mention that a bit more. And this also relate to your first comment. You, in fact, were more interested in these cases where religion is more implicit, but then the problem is that, again, I want to analyze the reasoning of the court and the discussion and the arguments of the different parties. So if no one argues about neutrality and about the issue of religion, then it doesn't fit with my aim. So this is why these kind of cases are not relevant for the kind of paper I want to do. But if I was doing more sociological analysis, maybe it would be. But then it would be a different paper.
I'm asking for another book, I think.
Yeah. And just one last point you made. Well, if I'm not too long.
1 second.
Yeah, just one thing you wanted me to clarify my argument, whether it's an issue of the court going in one direction and then in another, or whether I had changed my position. I do think that these three conceptions coexist, but I think in the first place you only had the first one, neutrality as absence of coercion, and then there is a series of cases in which you do see emerging this other conception, neutrality as absence of preference. And in parallel, in all these cases about wearing of religious symbol, which I didn't present in the paper, you can also see the court accepting as legitimate this third conception. So it's parallel. The question was, at a certain point, you could have thought that absence of preference had replaced absence of coercion. Yeah, but then Lotzi, in fact, gave us a different story. And then, the case of the court is an unfinished story. So you see then it depends on what it decides. And then we do see with Papa, sorry, I can't pronounce. Yeah. So it's a case about religious education that comes after Lotzi, in which the court does apply the same case law than in Folgero. So in this post-Lotzi case, but on a different topic, it does apply the neutrality as absence of preference. So it's still valid. And then you have the Perovic I presented. So it does seem that it's a question of topic, that there is an exception for religious symbols in which the court sticks with this more restricted conception of neutrality.
Okay, thank you. Merilin?
First of all, really, many thanks for doing such a great job, and my apologies again. I can't apologize. I mean, too much, I think. But thank you for the comments, and I think you're absolutely right that you can look at it in both from the national identity perspective as well. But I think that I took this moral security for the reasons that as it has been used also in the Russian own politics, and also actually it's kind of written into the its own national security agenda since 1997. So to me, just talking about national identity, maybe it does not convey all the sort of the weight of the term as moral security carries, and using that as trying to explain the framework indicates also that when you use this word security, it also implies that you have to defend something. Mm-hmm. With the national security, with national identity, probably you're talking about tradition, the heritages. It may be something nice and flowery and and something like that. But when you use already take into the play the security, that means something different. And in that specific context, being also written into the national security strategy, I think it carries a little different meaning or weight. So that's the reason. Why registration? I suppose one explanation I had for myself to do that was that exactly the reason that maybe at international level we do not that much debate what the minimum standards or what's a baseline here has to be for registration, whether we talk about European Court of Human Rights or Human Rights Committee. The baseline for registration, what is required or what is states can do to push registration back. That's that perhaps is one of the reasons. The other, of course, is that you cannot talk about everything, and this registration issue gives a nice example also in that Russia and core environment, Russia and the adjacent or the influence states environment gives a very good drastic picture of what is done with that baseline already. And your pick on the non-registration on that example, I think here resonates really very well as well, because non-registration in some of these countries mean that you cannot actually do the normal, activities what religious communities could do. Providing the education, even having a meeting would be a problematic thing to have. So this is all combined. Okay, I stop here.
Thank you.
We're running out of time anyway.
Okay, thank you. I'll be as brief as possible. So Effie, thank you so much for your questions and your comments. It's really rich. There's a lot of things to take on. You came to this as a non-lawyer. I came to this as a lawyer, so I have the inverse problem. I didn't come into this as a political scientist or a sociologist. And you're right, there's a difference of language here. And I am using the language of the court, the concepts of the court, the tests of the court, because that's a legal analysis. But you're right that sometimes, in many ways, it's impenetrable, especially to individual claimants and communities who want specific ideas and a specific, sense of potential for the claims. And it's interesting what you said about legalism in the US and people being more aware of some of those tests and how to use it. There is a book, to some extent, this might be coming in some ways in Europe. There is a book, this Eurolegalism book by Daniel Kellerman that I read recently called Eurolegalism, and makes that point. But of course, we're not there. But I was really interested in your point about the European Court of Human Rights selling some of the concepts like social solidarity better than other courts. And I think you're right. I'd never thought of that, but I think you're right. And the concept of living together, I remember from SAS case, is an example of that. Now, in terms of, there is an example I mentioned in the paper, which I didn't have the time to talk to you about, and it's Maria's colleague Novak, who is the star of the hospital, and he's a libertarian. He's against coercion in matters of individual healthcare. Any similarities with the Australian Open are purely coincidental. And the point I'm trying to make is that Maria's conscientious exemption should not be just preferentially treated because it's religious. So if in principle Novak's objection falls within the protective scope of the right, he should have an equal chance as Maria to be exempted, and he wouldn't be helped by Article 14 any more than Maria would have been helped either, because both those cases are cases of individual disadvantage. So Article 9 and Article 14 overlap in those cases. Now, on the question from the audience, if I could elaborate on the criteria about when a conscientious objection is possible. Now, I think there's a number of them, but the two that I'd like to just focus on is that the believer must convince the courts that their belief falls within the protected scope of Article 9 and Article 14. That's the first one. The second one is that not exempting them must be absolutely necessary for the legitimate aim of the law or the policy in question, so for public health. And every case will have to be dealt with on its own merits. So it's a case of equal regard in this case, and that's related to neutrality actually and its requirements. This is what it would require in this case, a case-by-case examination on the facts. Now, okay, last question by Roland. Roland, I made both those points in the full paper, but I didn't have the time to elaborate. So I made that the scientific assumption, the scientific evidence, the assumption I made was that being vaccinated means that you transmit the virus much less if you're vaccinated. And you're right, if there is evidence, medical evidence that doctors are better protected than others, probably that would change everything. But as I said in my presentation, the evidence basis of those laws or policies is extremely important, will be strictly scrutinized by the courts. So I agree with you.
Thank you. This was an extremely rich exchange of views, wasn't it? So the authors are invited to refine, articulate their texts before publication. We will come back to that issue a little bit later. So we will not skip the coffee break, but we have to run into the coffee bar. So please stand up and run. We will be back at, First upload, yeah, please. Wonderful job. Wonderful job. So what time should we be back? 4:30 at the latest. Right. 20 minutes.